Assalamu alaikum. My name is Naz Qureshi. Thank you for joining us today in honor of the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I would just like to acknowledge that we are meeting here on Treaty 6 ground. As Canadians and those living in Canada, we remind ourselves as well of the calls for justice in the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Joining me here today is Sadia Samiullah, a registered social worker in the city of Edmonton. Assalamu alaikum, Sadia, and thank you for joining us.
Walaikum assalam, Naz, and thank you so much for having me.
So I'll just start off with the first question. Are there aspects within Islam that you find particularly support and celebrate women and womanhood? If so, can you share your thoughts with us?
Thank you for the question, Naz. I feel that this question for me has two aspects. So first of all, I would look at just the religious piece and the spiritual significance of it. Islam has placed paradise under the feet of mothers. So that elevates the status of womanhood more than anything. Other than that, I would say that the second aspect is me following our Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, as an epitome, as an embodiment of kindness for humankind.
Perfect. Thank you. Sadia, do you find that there's any aspects within Islam or any religion in particular which you find are harmful to women? And could you shed some light on that for us?
To the best of my knowledge, none of the holy scriptures would ever encourage violence against women. And when we talk about, in particular, the context of today's conversation, that is violence against women, I would say that we're talking about two different things. So religion and culture are two separate entities. And as I said, in my knowledge, there is no religion that would encourage violence against women or violence in general, as per se. But when you talk about the cultural aspect, that is a different story. And I believe that culture is something that is rooted within us. And we have our own individual cultures. So say, for example, you and I both come from Pakistan, both of us are women, but we might have very different cultural experiences. So there are cultures within cultures. And sometimes when we think about culture, looking at one person or looking at one story, we have broad and sweeping generalizations for that whole culture or all the folks coming from that culture. So again, that would be kind of the danger of a single story, that you use one example to kind of generalize everybody coming from the same culture. So when we talk about cultural practices, I would say that in the South Asian culture, I think I would just elaborate that to kind of broaden the spectrum a little bit. And this is coming from me as a service provider, working in the front lines, and I'm just bringing into the room all the clients that have allowed me very humbly to work with them. I would say that for the South Asian culture, what I've observed is that the relationship that a woman has in particular for the institution of marriage with her intimate partner is not just a man and a woman. It is actually a family that gets kind of involved and connected with another family.
Yes.
And it's those extended relationships and those complicated and complex dynamics, I would say. And I intentionally say that because we are alluding to conflict in relationships. They come into play. And what I also observe is that I wouldn't say sometimes or most of the time, but it does happen, that violence against women is not just coming from men. It actually gets perpetuated from in-laws and from women as well.
Yes, yes, it's very unfortunate. Sadia, so you spoke a little bit about culture and cultural practices. What would you recommend? How can we differentiate in today's world between what is culture and what is religion?
That's a very interesting question. And I think that invites some personal introspection and taking responsibility. because I can choose to be not informed. I wouldn't say ignorant, but informing myself and making informed choices is the onus is on me. It's my responsibility. So say, for example, to put your question in a particular context, if I'm working with a woman, I would actually ask the woman what culture means to her, if it is a protective factor or if it is a barrier for her to access services, and then leave it to her to educate me on how I would help her to help herself.
Right.
So again, to go back to your question, I would say that how would we contextualize this in this world? I think the onus is on us to learn about the cultural practices of the person you're walking with.
Mhm.
Again, as a service provider, I would say that we all have assumptions, and it's always the most courageous thing to do to ask people what culture means to them
Mhm.
and how safety planning would look like. Again, going back to the crux of the matter, that is eliminating violence against women. As I mentioned earlier, when you look at the South Asian cultural dynamics, you have a lot of intricate nuances that are unique to the culture. So let's say the practice of dowry or preference for a male offspring, or let's say inheritance issues around land and property and whatnot, or let's say threatening a woman with another relationship or second marriage. These are all dynamics that are very inculcated or intertwined in the South Asian culture in particular. So again, going back to your question, the onus is on us now to educate ourselves and also to challenge ourselves. Say if I was raised with particular cultural beliefs, it is on me to see how helpful or harmful they are.
Yes, absolutely. Sadia, I think that for myself, being, and I think for others who are Canadian Muslims, I think that we're almost afforded an opportunity to better distinguish between what is culture and what is Islam. And again, this is just my personal opinion, but I feel that the yardstick that we as Muslims should use to gauge whether it is culture or religion is if it is not rooted in rahmah, in mercy, in compassion, and if it's not beautiful, it's not from our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because he said, I was sent as nothing but a mercy to humankind. So I think that it's a good starting point, but we see it all the time, how closely, and I think especially being Pakistani, and Pakistan was created as an Islamic state, we see how closely intertwined culture becomes with religion. It's part and parcel of our identity.
It really is. And again, I think, as I said earlier now, is that it really depends how we actually use culture for our benefit or not. And what I find is that this is coming again from my perspective as a service provider, that I have worked with family violence with across genders and across ages. And what I also find is that mostly men, the men that I work with at least, they admit to hiding behind culture. And what that means is that they would use culture as an advantage to them. So let's say if they were looking at the patriarchal practices to perpetuate power and control, or if you're looking at probably having an upper hand in the relationship, having that, I would say, autonomy or single-handed kind of perspective of making taking relationships to probably a toxic level, I would say. Again, the impression of toxic masculinity comes in. Again, we don't exist in silos, we exist in relationship to each other. And when we look at culture, we belong as a cultural, as a social human being that is connected to relations, that is connected to a larger picture. And mostly I find that with men that I worked with, most of them were actually referred by the probation services for perpetuating family violence, domestic violence in particular. And they said that they didn't know better. Nobody took the time to teach them about emotional regulation. Anger, especially, was validated as an expression of emotion for men.
Right.
So again, this is something to think about. That let's say if you look at, for example, South Asian movies, 20 years back, what does the expression of a villain look like? How do they express anger? And that is sanctioned. So let's say if we reverse the role, would we be comfortable watching a woman in that role, enacting the same
Right.
scene, right? So
Right.
basically, it's about, again, educating ourselves, and the onus is on us to see what's harmful and what's not. But again, looking at taking responsibility and accountability, I would say that as a woman, as a mother, it is on me to teach my son how to recognize his emotions, how to regulate his emotions, how to respect women. Again, this
Absolutely.
is something that comes from my religion and from my culture as well.
Right. Absolutely. Well, perfect. Thank you, Sadia. That was greatly summed up. And it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Assalamu alaikum.
Like